After the end of Roman rule, the period leading into the early Middle Ages is often described as an age when infrastructure lost its importance and political authorities paid little attention to maintaining it. According to this view, organized systems such as roads, bridges, and public works declined until centralized states, and expanding trade revived them centuries later. Yet the reality was more complex. Although the quality and scale of infrastructure certainly declined compared to the Roman era, local communities and emerging political powers developed practical and flexible ways to manage what remained. Long before the year 800, improvised maintenance and small-scale management had already replaced the centralized Roman administrative system, sometimes with considerable effectiveness. Across continental Europe and in Britain, infrastructure maintenance gradually became more regular and even gained legal support, though early evidence often reflects military concerns. Over time, however, the repair and use of older roads and communication networks became an important feature of early medieval political strategy, especially under rulers who recognized their value for movement, control, and communication. Infrastructure in this period should not be understood only as complete and functioning networks. In early medieval Britain, the concept included scattered remains of earlier systems, such as surviving stretches of Roman roads, damaged bridges, abandoned fortifications, storage buildings, and roadside stations. Even ruins themselves played an important role. They provided ready sources of building materials and carried symbolic meaning as visible reminders of the past. Their usefulness did not depend entirely on their physical condition. A structure did not need to function perfectly in order to serve political or social purposes. Ruined buildings, for example, could shape identity, authority, and memory, becoming powerful elements within new social and political landscapes. Infrastructure also extended beyond physical structures. It included social systems, institutions, traditions, and even intellectual frameworks that organized society. Roads, waterways, and buildings existed alongside legal practices, administrative habits, and shared cultural ideas. All of these formed interconnected systems that supported political authority and social order. In late antique and early medieval Britain, physical, social, and symbolic forms of infrastructure existed together and often held equal importance. The idea of infrastructure as a stable and coherent system may not have been clearly recognized at the time, but these networks nonetheless provided the foundation upon which early political communities functioned. They enabled rulers to regulate movement, control resources, and manage exchange, transforming inherited structures into tools of governance. The concept of governance itself in the early medieval world has long been debated. Traditional narratives often portray this period as one of political collapse, where centralized authority disappeared, especially in regions such as Britain or the Balkans. However, closer study reveals a different picture. Evidence from both written sources and archaeology shows continuous management of land and resources, though often on a smaller and more localized scale than in Roman times. Landscapes were carefully organized, estates were administered, and communities maintained systems of authority. Even in regions where political structures had changed dramatically, the practical need to organize society never vanished. Letters, legal documents, and administrative records from the period reveal active forms of governance. They show detailed attention to estate management, local administration, and economic organization. Religious institutions, especially the church, played a central role in these processes, often acting as powerful administrative authorities, alongside or even in place of secular rulers. Without considering the Church's influence, the structure of early medieval governance cannot be fully understood. Documentary evidence from various regions demonstrates that administration continued, although its scale, methods, and structures had been transformed. What it meant to govern changed significantly, yet the need for governance remained constant. Rather than centralized states in the modern sense, early medieval societies were organized as political communities, or polities with flexible structures. These systems relied heavily on regional authority and local participation. Communities themselves often played key roles in maintaining order and managing resources. Governance became more fluid, adaptive, and negotiated, shaped by local conditions rather than imposed through large bureaucratic institutions. Within this context, certain elements functioned as what may be called governance resources. These were any material or symbolic tools that could support administration and control. They included infrastructure, legal traditions, coins, documents, customs, and collective memory. Such resources helped political authorities organize territory, define boundaries, and regulate economic life. Studying these resources provides valuable insight because direct evidence of governance practices is often limited, while the resources themselves are more visible in surviving records. The existence of a resource alone, however, was not enough. Political authorities needed the ability to use it effectively. This required economic capacity, social influence, and symbolic authority. Without such means, even valuable resources could remain unused. Early medieval governance was therefore a process of negotiation between available resources, political actors, and practical capabilities. Power depended not only on what existed, but on the ability to activate and adapt what had been inherited from the past. Elements of the landscape illustrate this process clearly. A Roman road, for instance, could serve multiple purposes. It might function as a transportation route, a path for seasonal movement of livestock, or simply a marker defining territorial boundaries. Even when no longer usable for travel, its physical presence could still structure political and legal relationships. The condition of the resource determined how much effort was required to use it, but even degraded infrastructure could retain significance. In some cases, former Roman structures passed into the hands of the church. Fortifications, for example, were often transferred through legal agreements and transformed into religious institutions. Political rulers, who lacked the resources to maintain these sites, could still benefit from them by supporting their conversion into monasteries or ecclesiastical centres. These transformed sites frequently became important centres of trade, production, and political influence. Through such exchanges, rulers converted unused physical resources into political alliances and economic advantages. The question of continuity between the Roman world and the early medieval period remains one of the most complex issues in historical interpretation. Scholars have long debated whether this transition represents collapse, transformation, or adaptation. The idea of continuity itself is difficult to define. Some understand it as an unbroken connection between past and present, while others view it as selective preservation combined with change. In many cases, what appears to be continuity is better understood as adaptation to new circumstances. Urban life provides a clear example. Roman towns in Britain did not continue to function exactly as they had before, yet many locations remained inhabited and retained symbolic importance. The character of urban life changed, but the significance of certain spaces endured. Instead of a simple continuation or complete break, there was a process of reinterpreting and reshaping inherited environments to serve new purposes. The traditional contrast between continuity and discontinuity often oversimplifies historical reality. It assumes a clear division between one period and another, even though historical change is usually gradual and complex. Attempts to identify decisive turning points, such as the year traditionally associated with the end of Roman rule in Britain, reflect the human desire to impose clear boundaries on processes that were in fact uneven and prolonged. Archaeological and historical evidence frequently offer different perspectives on continuity. What appears as continuity in material remains may not correspond to institutional or social continuity, and vice versa. In many cases, it is more accurate to speak of negotiation with the past rather than direct inheritance. Earlier structures, traditions, and institutions were reused and reinterpreted, rather than simply preserved. At the same time, certain forms of continuity are undeniable. Religious institutions, particularly the Church, maintained organizational stability and transmitted cultural traditions across centuries. Political leaders often presented themselves as heirs to Roman authority, drawing legitimacy from the memory of the empire. The idea of Roman identity itself continued to evolve long after the political structures of the empire had changed. Being Roman could become a symbolic or cultural identity rather than a direct continuation of imperial institutions. Continuity, therefore, did not always require direct transmission. It could involve conscious reference to the past, symbolic imitation, or adaptation of earlier models. Historical actors often reinterpreted inherited traditions to support new political realities. The legacy of Rome existed not only in institutions, but also in memory, identity, and cultural imagination. The challenge of defining continuity is further complicated by differences in scholarly methods and perspectives. Historians, archaeologists, and social theorists approach the problem from different angles, emphasizing economic structures, political institutions, cultural identity, or material evidence. As a result, no single definition can fully capture the complexity of historical change during this period. Rather than viewing continuity as a simple preservation of the past, it may be more accurate to see it as conscious reuse, shaped by historical awareness. Earlier structures and traditions were not passively inherited, but actively adapted to meet new needs. Transformation, growth, and decline occurred simultaneously, producing societies that were neither entirely Roman nor entirely new. Reuse is not a side story in the life of a building or a transport network. It is one of the main ways a place survives at all. Sites and structures rarely experience a single, clean lifespan with a clear beginning and end. They are used, set aside, altered, scavenged, repaired, reoccupied, and reimagined. That afterlife is not something separate from their history. It is part of the history. In fact, the more a structure is taken up again for new purposes, the more likely it is to remain visible in the record. Reuse can preserve what would otherwise disappear, but it also changes the meaning of what is preserved. A wall that once defended a garrison might later define a boundary, support a church, supply building stone, or simply stand as a landmark that people talk about. None of those outcomes is neutral. Every new use reshapes how that place sits in time, how it is remembered, and how it continues to matter. At its core, reuse is about taking hold of something that already exists and activating it again. That might mean restoring an old function, but it can just as easily mean inventing a new one. It does not require an uninterrupted chain of ownership or a neat sequence that can be traced step by step. Often, the evidence does not show a clear handover from one community to the next. Reuse still happens. A site can fall quiet and later return to life, not once but many times, in cycles that include pauses, gaps, and layered revivals. Something used in one period can be reused, abandoned again, and then pulled back into service in a later phase. Sometimes the simplest form of reuse is just moving back into a place because it still offers shelter, security, or status. Yet even then, it can be hard to tell whether reoccupation was planned or simply practical. A later royal and religious complex built on the footprint of an earlier high-status estate might reflect deliberate selection, or it might reflect the basic fact that the location remained attractive. On the continent, there are cases where the gap between the original moment and the later return is so large that it becomes clear that reuse is not only practical. It can demand considerable ideological investment. Reviving an old place after centuries is never just a matter of convenience. It is also a statement. When people talk about reuse, the most obvious examples are material. Archaeology reveals how widely earlier monuments, not only Roman but also prehistoric, were drawn back into use in the early medieval world, sometimes as burial grounds, sometimes as markers of territory, sometimes as sources of stone. Yet the category becomes slippery as soon as it meets practices that blur the line between continuity and transformation. Consider money. In post-Roman Britain, coins continued to circulate in altered ways, sometimes being cut down and repurposed. Is that the same system continuing, or is it the same object being made to serve a new logic? If a coin is treated as a single item, it can simply remain an item of exchange. If coin use is treated as part of a wider economic service, something closer to an infrastructure of payment, then the practice can look like reuse even when the metal is the same. The meaning of an object can shift depending on who handles it and where it travels. In one community, it may still operate as currency. Outside that community, it may lose that function and become a fragment, a token, an ornament, or a store of silver valued more for material than for face value. The same small disc can carry different identities at once. Symbolic reuse makes the picture more complicated still. The early medieval world did not ignore the past, it worked with it. Old structures and old landscapes could be shaped into stories that justified authority, anchored communities, and linked present claims to earlier prestige. In Britain, earlier infrastructure often became a focal point for symbolic attention. A prehistoric monument or a Roman ruin could become a place where meaning gathered, even if the original function was no longer understood in detail. Narratives could be built around these contact points between physical remains and social imagination. Stories about conversion, power, or legitimacy could draw strength from the presence of an older structure and from the act of placing a new meaning upon it. This matters because reuse is not only about stones and timber. It is also about the interface between what is tangible and what is remembered. Roman roads offer a clear example. In some cases, they were still practical routes that could carry people, animals, and goods. In other cases, they served as lines on the land, useful for defining an estate or describing the reach of authority. These two roles could coexist. A road could be both a route and a boundary. Even when it was no longer suitable for travel, it could remain valuable because it was still visible. Documents describing land often use such features as anchors: a road, a ditch, a stream, a ridge. The road might appear in phrases that preserve a faint echo of an imperial past, not as scholarship, but as lived vocabulary. The name itself could signal memory. The road could be described as something belonging to an emperor, or as an old great way whose status was assumed. That sort of wording did more than point to a location. It placed the present landscape inside a longer frame of meaning. It turned a practical description into a layered statement about inheritance and authority. The gap between past and present is often hidden from view. That is one reason the idea of reuse is best treated as a process rather than a single event. Sometimes it is impossible to measure how long something lay, unused or half-used. Sometimes the gap was small. Sometimes it was vast. The evidence rarely offers a precise timeline. What survives instead is the trace of reactivation, a place brought back into a network of functions, or a ruin made to serve a new role. In that sense, talking about reuse is a way of acknowledging both what can be seen and what cannot. It accepts that the pause is often invisible while insisting that the return is historically significant. The question of cities and urban life in this period sits inside the same uncertainty. Even contemporaries could struggle to define what counted as a city. Late antique writers could describe a heavily fortified place with walls, gates, towers, and fertile land around it, and still express confusion about why it was not labelled a city. That confusion points to a deeper issue. Urban status was never only about buildings. It was also about functions, institutions, and expectations. In the early medieval world, the city is one of the most contested categories because it can be approached from so many angles, and because the evidence often refuses to line up neatly with later assumptions. For that reason, it can be more productive to think in terms of urban space rather than insisting on the city as a fixed type. Urban space can exist without meeting every classical criterion for a city. It can describe places where organized life takes on some urban characteristics without matching the full profile of an ancient civitas or a later medieval town. Transitional zones can also blur the line between rural and non-rural life. In such places, the landscape shows mixed traits: agriculture and craft, scattered settlement and concentrated activity, seasonal rhythms and institutional presence. The boundary between the countryside and the town becomes a gradient rather than a wall. This approach is especially useful in Britain, where the survival of classical urban life after the early 5th century is hard to demonstrate with certainty. The economic networks that sustained the Roman town system were damaged, and the structures that depended on them could not always endure in their earlier form. Yet that does not mean that every urban function vanished, or that every former town became irrelevant. Many places continued as focal points in new ways. Some were new foundations that developed in the wake of the Roman withdrawal. Others were old sites that shifted into different roles. The key is not to treat these places as failed cities measured against a later model, but as living environments that adjusted to changed circumstances. In many cases, what looks like urban survival is better understood as a kind of damage control. Retaining what was useful, discarding what was not, and reshaping inherited spaces to fit a new present. Defining what is urban has serious consequences. Some approaches rely on lists of criteria: fortifications, markets, specialized crafts, administrative functions, religious institutions, legal status. These lists can help, but they can also mislead. If the criteria are applied too loosely, almost any sizable settlement can be labelled urban. If they are applied too strictly, nearly nothing qualifies, especially in periods where evidence is thin. There is also the danger of measuring early medieval places against an ideal city type, drawn from either the Roman past or the high medieval future. That kind of teleological yardstick can flatten the diversity of early medieval settlement into a simple story of decline and revival. Another route is to focus on distinction and perception. A place might be urban because its people and its neighbours treat it as different. That difference can be social as much as economic. It can be expressed in language, in rites, in ritual, in the kinds of activities concentrated there, and in the way the site sits in local mental maps. Yet even this approach has limits. Communities can regard certain places as special without those places fitting modern expectations of urbanism. Legal and social difference does not always map neatly onto size, density, or economic specialization. The early medieval world contained many forms of concentrated life that do not fit a single box. A more workable picture emerges when urbanism is treated as a family of overlapping forms, rather than a single line of development. There can be late Roman urbanism that continues briefly beyond the formal end of Roman administration. There can be a quieter phase in which former urban sites persist as spaces rather than as full cities, places with partial functions, reduced populations, and shifting roles. There can then be later phases in which certain sites regain stronger economic or administrative profiles, though not always in the same way or at the same pace. These phases are not identical everywhere. They can overlap. They can reverse. A site can intensify, stall, and intensify again. Urban life is not a straight ladder. It behaves more like an ecosystem where different forms coexist, compete, and adapt to changing conditions. Some of the places that most resemble towns in this period may not be secular settlements at all, but major religious communities. Monasteries could draw people in, concentrate wealth, organize production, offer services, and project authority across wide regions. They could function as hubs of exchange and as centers of governance, even if they do not resemble a classic market town. This complicates any attempt to make economics the single defining feature of urbanism. Symbolic functions and institutional presence can matter just as much, and sometimes more. Urban spaces, whether full towns or more limited settlements, can be understood as resources of governance. They can help an authority control territory, display legitimacy, manage exchange, and coordinate movement. Yet controlling such a resource is not the same as benefiting from it. To tap into an urban space requires wealth, labour, and political capital. A ruler might hold nominal authority over a former Roman site, yet lack the means to restore its infrastructure or organise large-scale activity there. In such cases, the site's value may be more symbolic than practical, or its practical benefits may be captured by another actor, with greater capacity, such as the church. This tension between possession and activation shaped many outcomes in post-Roman landscapes. This perspective also changes how roads and transport infrastructure come into view. In post-Roman Britain, south of Hadrian's Wall, Roman routeways continued to shape the landscape long after the administrative system that built them had faded. Settlements often clustered near major roads. Burials appeared along them. Paths and place names reflected their enduring presence. Even when not maintained to Roman standards, the roads remained among the most visible inherited features on the island. Their very visibility made them useful. They could carry traffic in some stretches, serve as corridors for movement in others, and operate as lines of demarcation even where travel was difficult. In regions where resources were limited, systematic repair may have been rare, yet localized maintenance in strategic areas, especially near river crossings, was both plausible and in some cases unavoidable. One of the richest windows into this landscape is found in written records of landholding. Legal documents describing property and privilege had practical reasons to mention roads, bridges, and other striking features. These texts were not composed to preserve Roman history. They were composed to record transactions: who granted land, who received it, and how its boundaries were defined. Roads were convenient boundary markers because they were long-lasting and easily recognized. A straight, engineered road is difficult to erase from a landscape. Even when its surface breaks up, its line often remains. Yet these documents must be handled carefully. They are not neutral snapshots of administration. They are shaped by formula, by legal habit, by local politics, and by the needs of institutions that kept and recopied them. Some were altered or forged to support later claims. Others were compiled long after the events they describe, especially in contexts where an institution sought to strengthen its rights. by gathering older material into a single authoritative collection. In such cases, references to landmarks could be updated, modified, or removed if they no longer made sense to the compilers. A feature that was visible when an original record was created might have decayed or disappeared by the time the text was recopied centuries later. That does not mean the earlier feature never existed. It means the documentary trail is itself part of the afterlife. These records were also not purely written artifacts in the quiet sense that modern readers imagine. They could be performed. Transactions might involve public reading, ritual gestures, and displays of authority that gave the document power beyond its words. The language, layout, and staging of these texts mattered. They did not only describe control, they enacted it. That performative element means that references to old infrastructure were not simply practical notes. When a road was spoken aloud as a boundary, or when an ancient stone was named as a meeting point, the landscape itself became part of the political act. Within this documentary practice, roads appear frequently because they were common and useful. Milestones appear less often, but when they do, they reveal another layer of transformation. A marker that once measured imperial distance could become a local reference point, a named stone associated with a person, a boundary feature, a place of assembly, or even a site of religious meaning. In such cases, the old object survives by shifting identity. Its role changes, but it remains embedded in the way people describe space. The presence of Roman infrastructure in these records, therefore, reflects lived engagement with the inherited landscape. The people producing and using such documents were not trying to catalogue Roman remains. They were negotiating land, power, and rights in their own present. They noticed what lay around them and drew it into their practices because it helped them manage estates, organise authority, and make boundaries legible. This was not automatic. It was a choice made within constraints and opportunities. It shows that the Roman past was not merely rubble underfoot. It was a set of resources that could be activated, sometimes for transport, sometimes for administration, sometimes for symbolism, and often for several of these at once. The survival of Roman infrastructure in early medieval Britain did more than shape the physical landscape. It also influenced the way documents were written and how people understood land, authority, and memory. When legal records were created, the presence of Roman roads, bridges, and transport routes often shaped how boundaries were described and how claims were justified. This influence was not universal or consistent, but recognizing it helps explain why different groups of legal documents refer to Roman remains in different ways. The uneven appearance of Roman infrastructure in written sources reflects not only historical reality, but also the environments in which those documents were produced, and the traditions that shaped them. Legal documents produced in Wales followed a tradition that developed differently from those created in eastern parts of Britain. Although both forms of documentation shared roots in late Roman legal practices, they evolved along separate paths. In Wales, written charters often represented an adaptation of earlier legal traditions, adjusting inherited forms to suit new political realities. In eastern Britain, however, charters tended to function more directly as tools for activating existing legal authority and territorial control. Because some collections of Welsh documents were later compiled to defend institutional claims against rival authorities. It is difficult to determine how much of their content reflects original practices and how much reflects later editorial efforts intended to strengthen those claims. The surviving documentary record is incomplete in both time and space. Welsh charters primarily concern a limited region connected with the ecclesiastical centre of Llandaff and the surrounding area of southeastern Wales. By contrast, charters from eastern Britain mainly cover southern and central England. Many records from northern regions were lost due to warfare, destruction of religious institutions, and political upheavals. Although historical writings confirm that northern archives once existed, only fragments have survived. As a result, any understanding of early medieval governance and infrastructure must rely on uneven and selective evidence. The documents that remain span several centuries, from the 6th to the 11th century. Over this long period, ideas about Roman identity and Roman heritage changed significantly. For that reason, later documents cannot be used directly to explain the practices of earlier centuries. Yet legal charters possess a unique relationship with time. They preserve moments of administrative activity and offer stable reference points that capture how past societies understood authority, land, and history. Even as their language and form evolved, they provide valuable snapshots of changing attitudes toward Roman infrastructure and governance. No other group of written sources offers such a broad perspective on the continued use of Roman transport networks in Britain. The documents from Eastern Britain form a particularly rich collection. More than 1,500 charters survive, including royal grants, church donations, private land transfers, and wills. Some exist as original documents, while others survive only in later copies. The earliest known examples date from the early 7th century, though many have been questioned in terms of authenticity. The first documents widely accepted as genuine appear slightly later, emerging from regions such as Kent, Surrey, and the early West Saxon territories. The absence of earlier examples may result from accidental loss through war or fire, or from the use of writing materials that did not survive the northern climate. The origins of charter writing in England remain uncertain. Some scholars attribute its introduction to religious leaders or early kings who had contact with continental traditions, where similar legal practices had continued from late Roman times. Others argue that the form was reintroduced to Britain after a period of disappearance. Regardless of its origin, the charter became a powerful legal instrument that shaped how land was defined and controlled. Many charters contain detailed descriptions of property boundaries. These boundary clauses describe the landscape in practical terms, identifying rivers, hills, roads, and other features that mark the limits of an estate. Early examples were written mainly in Latin, but over time, increasing numbers were composed in the local language. This shift reflects broader cultural changes and demonstrates how inherited Roman practices were adapted to new social contexts. Similar developments occurred elsewhere in Europe, where local languages were gradually incorporated into legal documentation. Boundary descriptions provide valuable insight into how Roman roads were distributed and understood in the early medieval landscape. However, interpreting this evidence requires caution. The surviving data is fragmentary, spans several centuries, and includes documents whose authenticity is debated. Even so, disputed or forged documents can still offer important information. Forged records reveal how later generations wished to present their past and defend their claims. When describing land boundaries, inventing landscape features that did not exist would have undermined a claim's credibility. For that reason, references to roads and other physical features in such documents often reflect real elements of the landscape. Charters also reveal that memory played a central role in early medieval society. Written records were not simply tools of administration, but instruments for shaping historical understanding. Institutions depended on their ability to control and preserve memories of their past, and the loss of that memory could threaten their authority. Legal documents, therefore, serve both practical and symbolic purposes, defining property while also reinforcing historical identity. References to Roman roads in boundary descriptions provide important evidence of how early medieval communities interacted with inherited infrastructure. These roads reveal not only their physical locations, but also their social meaning. They were often multifunctional. A road could serve as a transportation route, a boundary marker, or a source of building materials at the same time. The terminology used to describe them shows that they were recognized as remnants of a distant imperial past, even as their functions evolved. Roman roads were particularly useful for defining boundaries because of their visible and durable construction. Their straight lines and paved surfaces made them easy to identify in the landscape. In some cases, political borders followed the routes of Roman roads. One well-known example involves a major Roman road used as a boundary between rival rulers in the 9th century. In other situations, roads simply marked the limits of estates or served as convenient reference points in land descriptions. Some routes became so closely associated with boundary functions that their names reflected this role. Certain roads were described specifically as boundary roads, indicating that they had served this purpose for generations. These examples show how infrastructure originally built for imperial administration was gradually incorporated into local systems of governance. The terminology used in these documents reveals a complex vocabulary for describing roads. Different words could refer to major highways, minor tracks, or simply paths through the landscape. Some terms clearly indicated Roman origin, while others were more ambiguous. Linguistic confusion sometimes makes it difficult to determine whether a particular reference describes a Roman road, a prehistoric route, or a later construction. Words used to describe ditches or embankments could also refer to elevated roads, especially those built on raised foundations. A common term for paved roads derived from the Latin expression for a constructed way, and was usually associated with Roman routes. Over time, however, the same term could be applied to roads built in later periods or even to ancient paths, predating Roman occupation. The continued use and maintenance of older routes blurred the distinction between different historical layers of infrastructure. Settlements located near such roads often reflected their importance, demonstrating how transportation networks shaped patterns of habitation and governance. The meaning of public roads also changed over time. Earlier legal concepts referring to major highways gradually evolved, sometimes coming to describe military routes or roads, maintained by royal authority. Legal traditions emphasized the importance of safe travel along designated routes, and those who avoided these main paths could be viewed with suspicion. Such developments show how Roman legal ideas were transformed within new social and political contexts. Glossaries produced by students in the late 10th and early 11th centuries provide further insight into how people understood the terminology associated with roads. These texts explain technical terms and distinguish between different types of routes, including private roads and constructed highways. The need to explain such terms indicates that knowledge of Roman infrastructure remained significant, even if its original context had faded. Scholars have debated whether the use of Roman roads as boundaries reflects continuity in land ownership from Roman times. Some interpretations emphasize breaks in settlement patterns, while others argue for more complex processes of adaptation. Evidence from burial practices and landscape use suggests that changes in settlement patterns often reflected shifting social and political conditions rather than complete abandonment of earlier systems. Local communities adapted inherited structures in different ways, demonstrating flexible strategies rather than simple decline. Detailed case studies illustrate how Roman infrastructure was reused and maintained. In one urban centre, A series of documents spanning more than 2 centuries describes the same network of streets within a city originally planned during the Roman period. These records show that the layout of major roads remained largely unchanged, even as buildings were modified and new institutions developed. Archaeological evidence confirms that while minor alterations occurred, the overall structure of the road network remained stable. The continued use of these routes suggests that Roman urban planning continued to shape local governance long after imperial authority had disappeared. In some regions, major roads associated with economic activity retained their importance for centuries. One notable example involves routes used for transporting salt, a valuable resource in early medieval economies. These roads connected production centres with distant markets and may have supported systems of taxation inherited from Roman administration. Legal documents referring to these routes demonstrate their continued significance well into the 10th century. The maintenance of such roads reflects both economic necessity and political control. Salt production remained a major industry throughout much of early medieval Britain. Large production centres continued to operate on a substantial scale, and rulers often maintained monopolies over this resource. Long-distance trade networks connected these centres with major urban markets, demonstrating the persistence of economic systems rooted in earlier imperial practices. The continued use of transport routes associated with salt distribution illustrates how Roman infrastructure could remain active as a tool of governance. Regional differences in the orientation of these trade routes reveal the diversity of local adaptation strategies. Some routes connected economic centres to major cities, while others linked regions across different geographic zones. These variations demonstrate that inherited infrastructure was not simply preserved, but reinterpreted according to local needs. The reuse of Roman systems extended beyond roads to include bridges, which played a vital role in transportation networks. Bridges were more difficult to maintain than roads, particularly those constructed from timber, yet some remained in use for centuries. Early medieval writers regarded surviving Roman bridges as visible signs of imperial heritage. Archaeological evidence suggests that several major bridges continued to function, providing essential connections across rivers. Legal documents occasionally mention bridges in boundary descriptions. Some references describe bridges associated with industrial activity, while others refer to crossings connected with major estates or religious centres. In certain cases, stone bridges appear to have remained in good condition and were likely maintained due to their strategic importance. These structures not only facilitated movement, but also symbolised continuity with the Roman past. One particularly striking example describes a bridge identified as belonging to foreigners. The name suggests a memory of those who built or maintained it, possibly referring to earlier communities perceived as culturally distinct. Such terminology reveals how infrastructure could preserve historical memory and express social differences. Bridges were essential resources, often difficult to replace and therefore highly valued. Their maintenance required considerable effort, and their continued use reflects their importance within local economies and political systems. In early medieval England, accounts written by church historians sometimes offer unexpected details about the physical landscape. One story tells of a bishop travelling along a remarkably straight and wide road, smooth enough for riders to race their horses. The focus of the tale is a miracle, yet the setting itself reveals something important. Such descriptions suggest that long stretches of Roman-built roads were still visible and usable centuries after the end of Roman rule. However, their condition was not necessarily ideal. A road might be considered usable even when its surface was uneven or partially damaged, which indicates that standards of maintenance had changed significantly from Roman times. Legal documents from the period also mention roads, but they rarely describe their physical condition or how frequently they were used. Instead, these routes often appear simply as landmarks that defined property boundaries. A road could be recorded in a charter even if it had fallen into disrepair or was no longer actively maintained. Some documents even distinguish between well-preserved routes and those described as broken or ruined. Such descriptions reveal that medieval people recognized differences in the state of infrastructure, even if no formal system existed to classify or maintain these roads. Occasionally, a damaged road is clearly identified in land descriptions, where its location helps establish the borders of an estate. In certain cases, these references correspond closely with known Roman routes. The terminology used in these records shows that medieval writers distinguish between different kinds of paths and highways, suggesting a practical awareness of their varying functions and conditions. Although such evidence cannot establish a universal pattern of maintenance, it demonstrates that people recognized which roads remained functional and which had deteriorated. Place names also provide clues about the state of infrastructure. Some locations were named after damaged bridges or ruined crossings, preserving the memory of structures that had once played an important role in travel and communication. Such names may reflect changing environmental conditions, shifting river courses, or the gradual collapse of earlier constructions. Even when physical remains disappeared, their memory survived in language, offering indirect evidence of how landscapes evolved over time. Beyond physical descriptions, legal records raise questions about responsibility for maintaining roads and bridges. Certain documents refer to public roads, a term that may have emphasized their importance and suggested obligations connected to their upkeep. In some cases, receiving a grant of land may have carried duties, such as repairing roads, maintaining bridges, building fortifications, or providing military service. These responsibilities reflect a system in which infrastructure was closely tied to governance and social organization. The idea that communities shared responsibility for maintaining essential infrastructure has been widely debated. Some scholars argue that such obligations were introduced later under continental influence, rather than developing locally. Others suggest that these duties grew out of existing practices and were merely reinforced by foreign legal traditions. Regardless of their origin, the need to maintain roads and bridges was a practical necessity for any organized society, especially where transportation supported trade, communication, and defense. Archaeological evidence indicates that although the construction of new bridges was relatively rare before the 10th century, existing structures were sometimes repaired or reused. Even if many bridges fell into disrepair, enough remained in service to require some form of regulation. This suggests that maintenance was not entirely neglected, but rather carried out selectively where infrastructure retained strategic or economic importance. The language of certain legal documents implies obligations even when they are not stated explicitly. References to public crossings, river fords, or major roads often appear in connection with estates located near important transport routes. These areas, especially those situated in river valleys or near former Roman settlements, formed natural centres of activity. Their continued use likely required some degree of maintenance and administrative oversight. Religious institutions gradually assumed a significant role in preserving infrastructure. Churches and monasteries sometimes became responsible for maintaining roads and bridges associated with their lands. This development reflects earlier legal traditions that treated the repair of public routes as a universal obligation, binding all members of society, regardless of rank or status. Such ideas had deep roots in earlier imperial systems, where infrastructure was considered essential for the functioning of the state. The persistence of these practices shows how elements of Roman administrative culture continued to influence later societies. Even after central authority weakened, local communities retained certain customs related to infrastructure management. Over time, these customs became embedded in local law and practice, surviving not as formal continuations of earlier systems, but as practical solutions to everyday needs. Later, legal traditions reinforced the importance of major routes by placing them under royal protection. Interfering with a highway, altering its course, or obstructing travel could be treated as a public offence. Such measures reveal an increasing recognition of roads as shared resources essential for political stability and economic activity. Although these laws often appeared in later or reconstructed legal texts, they reflect broader attitudes toward infrastructure that had developed over centuries. The continued use of former Roman roads also shaped patterns of cultural and economic exchange. Trade goods, foreign objects, and new ideas often spread along these routes, demonstrating that the old network still structured movement across the landscape. Even when their original administrative framework had vanished, these roads continued to function as channels of communication and control. In some regions, the maintenance of certain routes was closely connected with military activity. Roads used by armies or maintained for defense purposes may have been preserved more carefully than ordinary paths. This connection recalls earlier practices in which major routes served both civilian and military functions, blurring the distinction between the two. The long-term survival of these systems reflects the lasting impact of earlier governance. The physical layout of roads, fields, and settlements had been shaped over centuries, and these patterns did not disappear immediately with political change. Instead, they were adapted, reused, and gradually transformed to meet new needs. This process of adaptation allowed earlier structures to remain meaningful within changing social and political environments. A similar process can be observed in Western Britain, where surviving documents provide glimpses of landholding practices and infrastructure. These records, preserved in later compilations, often contain boundary descriptions that refer to roads, estates, and settlements. Although their authenticity is sometimes debated, the landscape references they contain likely reflect real features that were recognizable at the time of writing. These Western records show strong continuity in patterns of land ownership, from late antiquity into the early medieval period. Even as political authority fragmented, local communities maintained systems of property management that resembled earlier models. Written documents remained important tools for recording transactions and defining rights, reflecting the persistence of administrative habits inherited from the past. The terminology used in these records reveals different categories of roads. Some are described simply as major highways, while others are called old roads, indicating routes that had existed for a long time. In many cases, these descriptions correspond to known Roman routes, suggesting that the earlier network still shaped movement and settlement patterns. The concentration of road references in certain regions highlights areas of particular economic or strategic importance. Settlements near former Roman forts or mining districts often retained active transport connections. Roads linking these sites to coastal regions or commercial centres supported continued economic activity, demonstrating the enduring value of inherited infrastructure. In areas associated with resource extraction, such as gold mining regions, the survival of transport routes was especially significant. Mining operations required reliable connections between extraction sites and markets, encouraging the maintenance of roads, long after the end of Roman administration. These routes formed essential links in local economies, supporting both production and distribution. Legal practices related to land ownership also show traces of earlier traditions. In some regions, Rulers claimed authority over the redistribution of land in a manner resembling imperial power. This authority allowed them to reshape territories and grant estates, reinforcing their political legitimacy. Such claims were sometimes supported by traditions linking rulers to earlier imperial figures, providing symbolic justification for their authority. These legal traditions had practical consequences. By controlling land distribution, rulers could reorganize property boundaries, reshape settlement patterns, and influence the structure of rural landscapes. Over time, these processes produced significant changes in land use, even as they drew upon older legal concepts. The persistence of earlier administrative ideas reveals a complex relationship with the past. Rather than simply preserving ancient systems, early medieval societies adapted inherited practices to suit new conditions. Roman traditions were not copied directly, but were transformed into local customs, legal principles, and symbolic claims of authority. This gradual transformation illustrates how infrastructure and law continued to shape society long after the collapse of centralized rule. Roads, bridges, and legal traditions did not vanish, but evolved within changing political and cultural contexts. Their survival was driven less by deliberate preservation than by practical necessity. One of the clearest signs of continuity appears in the relationship between economic activity and infrastructure inherited from Roman times. Mining and resource extraction sites frequently remained active or were later reused, and the roads that connected them continued to serve practical functions. This pattern can be seen in the network of routes associated with salt production in Western Britain, and in transport connections linked to the gold mines of Wales. Such examples suggest that the Roman road system retained economic value long after the end of imperial rule, at least until major infrastructure projects of the late 9th century began reshaping patterns of movement. These later developments marked a shift away from earlier networks, although earlier systems had remained important for centuries. The evidence connected with salt production is particularly revealing. It demonstrates a broad system that relied on several elements inherited from earlier administrative structures, including transport routes, taxation practices, and extraction sites. Transforming this inherited system to suit new political realities required significant effort. Yet documentary records show that the salt industry continued to function effectively across various regions, displaying remarkable resilience. In some areas, especially in Western territories, the process resembles a gradual transfer of infrastructure from one ruling authority to another, while preserving core elements that originated in Roman administration. This continuity was not limited to Britain. Across many regions, sustained attention to local resources played a central role in maintaining communities. The careful management and adaptation of inherited infrastructure became one of the essential forces shaping society before the Norman conquest. The ability to maintain and reorganize such systems ensured economic survival and social stability, even as political structures changed dramatically. The charters themselves provide valuable insight into how post-Roman societies organized and governed their territories. They reveal strategies developed to manage inherited landscapes and adapt them to new circumstances. One significant feature is the persistence of obligations related to infrastructure in eastern regions, while western areas often preserved symbolic legal frameworks rooted in Roman tradition. By the time surviving documents were written, these older systems were already fading, yet their influence remained visible. It is likely that Roman legal traditions once played a broader role than surviving evidence suggests. Many practices may have been preserved in now lost documents, or absorbed into local custom. Even so, the surviving records show that certain legal obligations endured long enough to appear in documents written centuries after Roman administration had disappeared. These traditions did not survive as formal imperial law but were integrated into everyday practice, becoming part of the social and legal fabric of early medieval communities. Charters therefore served multiple purposes. They were practical tools that enabled communities to manage physical infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and estates. At the same time, they recorded the methods used to maintain and adapt these structures. They also preserved distinctions between different forms of authority and reflected evolving approaches to governance. Through their language and structure, these documents reveal how earlier traditions were reinterpreted and applied within changing political realities. The importance of such documents does not depend solely on their authenticity. Later records and even fabricated texts remain valuable because they reflect the ideas and assumptions of the societies that produced them. Whether genuine or reconstructed, they demonstrate how communities understood their relationship with inherited systems and how they justified claims to authority, property, and responsibility. In this sense, charters can be viewed not only as legal instruments, but also as narratives describing how small communities understood their past. They reveal the relationship between local societies and the legacy of Roman administration, showing how inherited structures continue to shape governance, economy, and identity. Through these records, one can observe the lingering presence of the empire as a powerful but transformed influence within early medieval Britain. The study of Roman influence extends beyond legal documents to the transformation of urban spaces. Evidence from material culture illustrates how elements of Roman infrastructure were adapted and reused in later centuries. A small writing tablet made of whalebone, produced in early medieval England, offers a striking example. Its form closely resembles earlier Roman writing tools, showing how technologies associated with literacy survived in modified contexts. Faint, carved letters suggest attempts to practice Latin expressions, reflecting the continued prestige of Roman learning even in a changing cultural environment. Objects such as this demonstrate the broader process of adaptation that affected many aspects of life. Roman technologies and practices did not simply disappear. They were reinterpreted and integrated into new social settings. These adaptations often blended older traditions with emerging cultural influences, creating hybrid forms that retained connections to the imperial past while serving new purposes. Urban spaces underwent similar transformations. The reuse of Roman buildings, streets, and public spaces did not represent a simple continuation of earlier urban life, nor did it signal complete collapse. Instead, towns evolved gradually as their functions changed. The decline of certain institutions and structures was accompanied by new forms of activity, reflecting shifting social and economic needs. Archaeological evidence suggests that many urban sites remained occupied after the end of Roman administration, although their functions often differed from their original purposes. Activity within these spaces might involve craft production, religious practice, or limited settlement rather than large-scale civic administration. This transformation represents adaptation rather than abrupt abandonment. The interpretation of these changes has long been debated. Some earlier views portrayed the end of Roman Britain as a sudden catastrophe, while others emphasized uninterrupted continuity. A more balanced perspective recognizes that urban transformation involved both decline and innovation. Infrastructure deteriorated in some respects, but was repurposed in others, reflecting practical responses to changing conditions. Regional variation played a decisive role in these processes. Developments differed widely across Britain, shaped by local conditions and the particular groups that assumed control of former Roman territories. In some areas, ecclesiastical institutions inherited urban spaces, while in others, military authorities or local elites took control. These varied patterns produced distinct regional trajectories, rather than a single uniform experience. The transformation of urban space also reflected earlier developments within the Roman period itself. Many changes associated with the early medieval era had already begun centuries earlier, particularly during periods of political and economic crisis in the empire. The transition from Roman to medieval society was therefore gradual, rooted in long-term structural change, rather than a sudden break. Linguistic evidence provides further insight into this continuity. Place names associated with towns and fortifications often preserve elements derived from earlier languages, reflecting the persistence of Roman concepts of urban space. Over time, some of these names disappeared, while others survived, particularly in locations of greater importance. This pattern suggests that the significance of urban centres helped preserve elements of the past within the evolving landscape. Connections with continental Europe also remained significant. Cultural and religious exchanges continued across the Channel, and political leaders maintained contact with neighbouring regions. These interactions required functioning transport networks and access to ports, implying that parts of the Roman infrastructure remained usable well into the early medieval period. Urban development in Britain also displayed distinctive characteristics compared with other regions of the former empire. Defensive walls often enclosed extensive areas of towns, shaping later patterns of settlement and transformation. Public buildings frequently lost their original functions and were repurposed for new uses, reflecting changing social priorities. Such developments mirror broader transformations occurring elsewhere in Europe, although local conditions produced unique outcomes. The overall picture that emerges is one of gradual change shaped by adaptation. Urban structures were neither fully preserved nor entirely abandoned. Instead, they were modified, reused, and integrated into new forms of social organization. This process reflects the resilience of inherited systems and the ability of communities to reshape them according to new realities. Understanding these developments requires moving beyond simple models of continuity or collapse. The history of post-Roman Britain reveals multiple pathways of transformation, influenced by regional diversity, economic necessity, and cultural exchange. The legacy of Roman civilization persisted not as a fixed inheritance, but as a flexible resource that societies continually reinterpreted. The period around the year 410 has long been presented as a dramatic turning point in British history. Yet, when viewed through the long development of human material culture, the moment appears far less decisive. Archaeological evidence suggests that daily life and social structures did not suddenly collapse. Many features of Roman Britain continued with little immediate disruption. Even the familiar idea that the Roman army withdrew entirely from the province has been challenged by discoveries showing ongoing occupation of forts along Hadrian's Wall and at sites further south. Military communities appear to have remained in place, adapting to new circumstances rather than abandoning their posts. If any forces left the island, they were likely limited to mobile field units, while frontier troops and their families continued to live and operate within established settlements. The political events of the early 5th century also reflect continuity rather than rupture. Figures such as Constantine, Gratian, and Marcus sought imperial authority rather than local independence, demonstrating that Britain remained deeply embedded in Roman political culture. Their ambitions were directed toward control of the empire itself, not the creation of separate regional powers. Meanwhile, the decline of Roman towns did not resemble sudden destruction, but rather a gradual reduction in activity. Urban life diminished slowly, and in many places the process extended over decades. Some scholars even suggest that the early 5th century may have been a period of relative stability, as communities adjusted to new conditions without widespread violence or disruption. One significant change was the disappearance of centralized military funding and supply systems. Soldiers were no longer supported through imperial administration, yet they did not immediately vanish from the landscape. Instead, frontier communities likely relied on local resources and land ownership to sustain themselves. Archaeological evidence from certain forts show structural changes that reflect adaptation rather than abandonment. These developments suggest that local populations reorganized economic and social life in response to reduced imperial involvement. The traditional sequence of important dates associated with Britain's separation from Roman rule reflects more the perspective of continental writers than the reality of the island itself. Many accounts were shaped by observers in Gaul whose concerns and political outlook differed significantly from those of Britain. As a result, the significance attributed to events such as the year 410 may represent external interpretations, rather than internal transformations. A document often cited as evidence of Rome's withdrawal from Britain illustrates this problem. The message attributed to the Emperor Honorius, instructing British communities to defend themselves, has frequently been interpreted as proof that the empire abandoned the province. Yet the document reveals little about the actual political situation. It may represent a temporary administrative decision or a response to specific local appeals, rather than a formal termination of Roman authority. Its later interpretation reflects the concerns of writers who sought to explain broader imperial decline rather than to describe conditions in Britain itself. The importance assigned to this moment therefore owes much to later historical interpretation. Britain did not suddenly become less Roman in the early 5th century. Key industries continued to operate for decades, including textile production, salt extraction, metalworking, and pottery manufacture. Rural settlements remained active and, in many regions, showed no signs of defensive construction, suggesting a relatively peaceful environment. Evidence once interpreted as proof of violent invasions has been reassessed, revealing little support for large-scale conflict. The fate of Roman towns has often been discussed in terms of survival or collapse, yet the evidence points to a more complex situation. Some settlements continued to function in altered forms, while others declined gradually. A number of locations have been proposed as examples of urban continuity, though their status as true cities remains uncertain. In many cases, activity persisted without preserving the full structure of Roman urban life. Rather than complete continuity, these sites demonstrate transformation and adaptation. Small settlements may have played a more important role than major cities in maintaining economic life. Modest towns located along roads or trade routes often possessed greater productive capacity and could adapt more easily to changing conditions. Archaeological evidence from several such sites reveals continued occupation, craft production, and exchange networks extending into the post-Roman period. These communities illustrate how local economies could persist, even as traditional urban institutions weakened. Cultural continuity also remained evident in certain forms of education and intellectual life. Religious figures of the 5th century appear to have received training within educational systems that retained strong connections to Roman traditions. Classical learning, literacy, and theological scholarship continued to shape cultural production. The survival of such educational structures indicates that Britain remained connected to the broader intellectual world of late antiquity. Political continuity, however, appears to have been limited. The idea that large urban elites preserved Roman administrative structures has little support in the archaeological record. Urban centres lacked the resources necessary to control extensive territories, and evidence for sustained civic authority is scarce. Political power became increasingly fragmented, with smaller regional communities maintaining local infrastructure and institutions. These localized societies preserved selected elements of Roman culture while developing new forms of governance. This fragmentation helps explain the uneven patterns of urban survival across Britain. Some regions retained aspects of Roman organization, while others followed different paths of development. Local political units often emerged from smaller territorial divisions, rather than from the large administrative districts of the Roman period. Over time, new political structures formed from these localized communities, reflecting the gradual reorganization of authority. Place names provide further evidence of changing political and social relationships. In contrast to other parts of the former empire, British towns rarely preserved the names of Roman tribal communities. This shift suggests a transformation in the connection between urban centres and political identity. Cities no longer served as primary markers of collective affiliation, and their significance diminished within emerging social structures. The persistence of Roman culture in Britain therefore occurred primarily at a local level. Economic practices, religious traditions, and intellectual activity continued within small communities, rather than within large urban systems. These localized forms of continuity allowed elements of Roman civilization to survive, even as the broader structures that had sustained them disappeared. Monetary evidence offers another perspective on this transformation. The decline of coin circulation has often been interpreted as proof of economic collapse, yet the continued use and modification of coins suggests a more complex reality. The widespread practice of clipping coins indicates both a shortage of new currency and a continued attachment to monetary exchange. Even as the supply of coins diminished, their symbolic significance remained strong, particularly the preservation of imperial imagery. Some imported coins from distant regions demonstrate that limited evidence of monetary exchange persisted into the 5th century. Older coins were reused, recirculated, and occasionally supplemented by foreign issues. Although the scale of economic activity declined, a reduced but functioning system of exchange continued to operate. This gradual transformation again challenges the notion of a sudden break in economic life. Urban decline must also be understood within the broader structure of Roman society, which was overwhelmingly rural. Agricultural production remained largely unchanged, and rural landscapes continued to support economic activity. Urban centres depended on these rural networks, and when political authority weakened, the resources required to maintain large cities became difficult to sustain. The transformation of urban life therefore reflects changing economic conditions, rather than catastrophic destruction. New forms of settlement emerged to replace traditional urban structures. Some communities combined features of both town and countryside, serving as centres of production, trade, and social organisation without adopting classical urban layouts. These settlements demonstrate how late Roman infrastructure could be reused in innovative ways, creating flexible and adaptive forms of social organisation. One such example shows a settlement organised into specialised zones for housing, craft production, and agricultural processing. Its structured layout and evidence of long-distance trade suggest a level of economic activity beyond simple subsistence. Yet it was not a city in the Roman sense. Instead, it represents a new form of community shaped by local needs and resources. Other sites reveal similar patterns of adaptation. Some former Roman towns continued to be occupied, but their functions changed significantly. Buildings were repurposed, burial practices evolved, and material culture reflected a mixture of local and continental influences. These changes illustrate the transformation of urban space from administrative centres into flexible resources used by emerging communities. The reuse of Roman infrastructure played a crucial role in these developments. Roads, fortifications, and public buildings provided valuable resources that could be adapted to new purposes. In later centuries, religious institutions and political authorities continued to recognize the strategic importance of these sites. Urban spaces acquired symbolic as well as practical significance, serving as centers of authority and identity. This transformation was not the result of widespread violence or cultural replacement. Archaeological evidence shows little indication of large-scale warfare during the period. Even heavily fortified regions appear to have experienced relative stability. Urban decline therefore resulted from changing political and economic circumstances, rather than external conquest. Traditional interpretations of this period have often been shaped by expectations of dramatic collapse. Such views emphasize the disappearance of certain forms of material culture, while overlooking evidence of continuity and adaptation. A more nuanced perspective recognizes the diversity of regional experiences and the gradual nature of social change. Religious institutions also played a role in shaping urban development. Although Christianity influenced urban life in other parts of the Roman world, its impact in Britain remains difficult to reconstruct. Some ecclesiastical structures maintained connections with former urban centres, while others operated independently of them. This suggests that the relationship between religion and urbanism evolved gradually and unevenly. The weakening of Roman administration further transformed the role of cities. Without imperial support, urban centres could no longer function as administrative hubs or military bases on the same scale. Communities therefore retained only those functions that remained useful, abandoning others that required extensive resources. Dense urban occupation and formal civic organisation gave way to more flexible patterns of settlement. Despite these changes, cultural activity continued. Artistic production, skilled craftsmanship, and intellectual work persisted in various forms. Archaeological discoveries reveal that complex artistic techniques remained in use well into the 5th century. Such evidence challenges assumptions of cultural decline and highlights the creative adaptation of Roman traditions. The transformation of Roman Britain was therefore a gradual process, spanning several generations. It involved the reorganization of political authority, economic systems, and social structures rather than their sudden destruction. Communities adapted inherited institutions to new conditions, reshaping the landscape while preserving elements of the past. By the middle of the 5th century, Roman urban space had largely ceased to function as cities in the classical sense. Yet these sites continue to serve as symbolic and practical resources within emerging societies. Their transformation reflects a broader process in which late Roman communities redefined their relationship with inherited structures, creating new forms of organization suited to changing circumstances. In the centuries after Roman rule faded in Britain, the transformation of cities, institutions, and governance did not follow a simple path of collapse or continuity. Instead, the process was complex, gradual, and shaped by adaptation. Some historians have questioned whether later British communities truly continued Roman administrative practices, or merely borrowed certain elements of imperial tradition. The idea that local Romano-British populations independently imitated Roman taxation systems or political structures remains uncertain, especially since such interpretations often depend on limited and difficult sources. Even so, traces of Roman administrative language and institutional habits suggest that certain concepts survived in altered forms. particularly in regions where urban traditions had once been strong. Writers from the period describe Britain as having rulers and judges, yet portray them as morally corrupt. This distinction between kings and judicial authorities may reflect more than rhetorical criticism. It could represent a memory of older legal roles, possibly rooted in Roman administrative traditions, even if the terminology was shaped by religious language. Some scholars have suggested that judges in this context may have been local officials chosen by regional elites, perhaps resembling earlier Roman magistrates. If such offices existed, they likely developed from earlier urban administrative structures and represent a form of institutional survival that continued even after cities themselves had physically declined. Evidence from early medieval inscriptions in Western Britain supports this interpretation, showing that titles associated with Roman civic offices remained in use long after the collapse of imperial rule. By the time these references were written, the administrative systems connected to Roman taxation and governance were already fading. Yet their meaning had not entirely disappeared. The continued use of these terms suggests that audiences still understood them, indicating a slow transition rather than a sudden break with the past. Land divisions and official titles connected to urban authority retained social importance, demonstrating that Roman infrastructure continued to influence political and social organization in subtle ways. During the 5th and early 6th centuries, many former Roman towns entered a transitional phase. They no longer functioned as full urban centers, but still provided limited services associated with city life. Some locations maintained small-scale economic activity, such as metalworking or agricultural processing, within former public buildings. Others continued to serve as local markets or production sites. Although these activities were modest, they reveal that urban spaces did not simply disappear but were reshaped to meet new economic realities. From the perspective of classical urbanism, this transformation represented decline. Yet, from a practical viewpoint, it was a logical response to changing political and economic conditions. Similar developments occurred in other parts of the late Roman world, where public buildings were converted into productive spaces rather than abandoned. As urban life diminished, many functions once concentrated in cities became dispersed across surrounding regions. Settlements in rural areas began to assume roles previously associated with urban centers, while activity within former cities changed in character. In some cases, populations moved from vulnerable towns to fortified hill settlements, a strategy consistent with late Roman military practice. Historical examples from continental Europe show entire communities temporarily relocating to defensible locations during periods of crisis. In Britain, however, many urban populations appear not to have returned permanently to their original settlements, leading to a gradual decline in city populations. Some former Roman towns experienced limited reoccupation over extended periods. In certain cases, elite groups reused urban sites, perhaps to connect themselves with the prestige of the Roman past. These occupations were typically small in scale and symbolic in nature rather than evidence of continued urban life. Archaeological debates about particular sites reveal the difficulty of interpreting such evidence. While activity clearly occurred within these spaces, it rarely resembled the functioning of a late Roman city. The transformation of these sites is better understood as adaptation rather than direct continuity. The symbolic importance of Roman heritage played a crucial role in this process. Inscriptions using Roman titles and terminology demonstrate a conscious effort to associate new political authorities with the authority of the former empire. Such symbolic references helped establish legitimacy and connected emerging communities to a prestigious past. Roman identity, even in a transformed environment, continued to shape political and cultural expression. Urban space itself gradually acquired symbolic meaning. Former cities sometimes functioned less as centres of dense population and more as locations associated with authority, tradition, and identity. Certain functions, including religious activity or political assembly, continued within these spaces, while economic and residential life shifted elsewhere. This created a form of governance distributed across multiple locations, in which different sites performed different roles within a broader system. Former Roman cities might serve ceremonial or ideological purposes, while surrounding settlements handled practical administration or production. Archaeological discoveries show that many of these areas maintained long-distance trade connections, including links with the Mediterranean world. Evidence of imported goods and coin circulation suggests that exchange networks continued into the early medieval period. These interactions indicate that Britain remained connected to wider economic systems and that some degree of monetary economy persisted. Such exchanges also reveal that the memory of Britain as part of the Roman world remained alive beyond the island itself. Religious literature from the period reflects similar patterns of continuity and transformation. Stories describing trade, famine relief, or political authority often refer to local leaders using traditional urban terminology, even when the settlements they governed no longer resembled classical cities. These accounts illustrate how older concepts of urban authority continue to shape perceptions of power, even in a transformed landscape. The symbolic reuse of Roman urban space extended into religious and political life. With the spread of Christianity, Roman sites gained renewed importance as locations for governance and ceremonial activity. Former Roman cities became places where authority could be performed and displayed. The minting of coins, for example, often took place in areas associated with Roman heritage, reinforcing connections to imperial legitimacy. Early coin designs frequently imitated Roman imagery, suggesting a deliberate effort to link new political authority with established traditions. Roman spaces also provided settings for assemblies, religious gatherings, and legal proceedings. The physical remains of the Roman past, including walls, public buildings, and amphitheatres, offered environments that conveyed authority and continuity. Such locations allowed rulers and religious leaders to present themselves as heirs to Roman traditions, strengthening their claims to power. In some regions, ecclesiastical authorities played a significant role in maintaining local administration. Religious institutions sometimes assumed responsibility for economic activities, including industrial production, that had previously been managed by the Roman state. This development reflects a broader transformation in which church leaders became central figures in both spiritual and political life. The adaptation of Roman infrastructure by religious communities demonstrates the flexibility of existing systems and their capacity to support new forms of authority. Former Roman public spaces also served new purposes as fortified settlements or assembly areas. Amphitheatres, for example, were sometimes converted into defensive structures or used for public gatherings. Their continued use illustrates how physical remnants of Roman urbanism remained integrated into early medieval society. Even when their original functions were lost, these structures retained symbolic and practical significance. Despite these continuities, early medieval Britain did not preserve Roman urbanism in its original form. Urban populations had always been relatively small, and political power gradually shifted toward rural elites and regional authorities. Legal codes from later periods rarely addressed urban life directly, reflecting the reduced importance of cities within social organization. Nevertheless, the legacy of Roman urbanism persisted through institutions, symbols, and spatial practices that continued to shape political and cultural life. The transformation of Roman Britain, therefore, represents neither complete collapse nor simple survival. Instead, it was a process of adaptation in which existing structures were reshaped to meet new circumstances. Urban spaces lost their traditional functions but gained new symbolic roles. Administrative institutions changed form while retaining elements of earlier practice. Religious and political authorities reused the physical and ideological resources of the Roman past to construct new systems of governance. Similar developments can be seen in places where laws were announced or royal councils assembled. These locations do not always correspond to former Roman cities. Instead, many assembly sites were situated in woodland clearings or along major routes. Their placement near Roman roads suggests that communication and accessibility were more important than direct continuity with earlier urban centres. Burial sites also frequently appear along these roads, indicating that networks of movement played a central role in shaping the landscape of power. This shift does not represent a rejection of the Roman past, but rather reflects changing political realities, expanding administrative systems, and new sources of authority. Roman heritage continued to matter, yet it was no longer the sole foundation of legitimacy. The symbolic use of Roman spaces continued alongside practical considerations in later developments, including fortified settlement programs that made use of earlier infrastructure. Roman sites remained valuable not only for their defensive advantages but also for the authority they represented. Control over such places strengthened political claims and helped rulers connect their power with a prestigious past. A revealing example of the importance of Roman urban space as a source of authority appears in an early medieval narrative describing a battle in which 3 cities were supposedly captured. Modern scholarship has cast serious doubt on the historical accuracy of this account. Archaeological evidence does not support the idea that thriving Roman cities were conquered in the way described. Instead, the account appears to have been created later as a political statement designed to justify territorial claims. The significance of this narrative lies not in its historical accuracy, but in what it reveals about early medieval perceptions of Roman cities. The claim that certain cities had been captured was a powerful way of asserting authority over a region. Even if the cities themselves no longer functioned as major urban centres, their Roman heritage carried immense symbolic weight. To control or claim such a place meant to inherit a connection with the Roman past and to assert a form of political legitimacy rooted in that tradition. The region associated with these claims offers further insight into the transformation of Roman urban space. Some areas preserved elements of Roman organisation longer than others, and in certain regions older administrative and cultural structures survived well into the early medieval period. Over time, these areas experienced significant changes in land ownership and governance, often reflected in legal documents that recorded the transfer of property to religious institutions. Such documents played a crucial role in reorganizing social and political relationships, creating new networks of power that still drew upon the authority of the Roman past. These legal instruments did more than record transactions. They reshaped the landscape by redefining ownership and establishing new centers of influence. Regions with large numbers of such records reveal intense political and economic activity, suggesting that earlier Roman structures were being reorganized rather than simply abandoned. The use of written documentation itself reflects a continuation of administrative traditions that had their roots in Roman practice. Former Roman cities, therefore, became valuable governance resources. Their importance did not depend on continued urban life, but on their symbolic power. They served as reference points for political authority, facilitated the distribution of land, and provided a connection to the heritage of Roman rule. Rulers who controlled these sites could present themselves as successors to the empire, strengthening their position within complex and competing systems of regional power. Economic factors also contributed to the continued importance of Roman infrastructure. Long-distance exchange networks relied on roads, production systems, and trade routes established during the Roman period. Movement of goods, including precious metals and agricultural products, depended heavily on this inherited infrastructure. Cultural exchanges likewise followed these routes, allowing technologies and practices to spread across the island. Even everyday activities such as textile production carry traces of Roman influence, demonstrating how deeply these traditions had penetrated local society. The transformation of Roman urban spaces must therefore be understood through the concept of adaptation, rather than simple continuity or decline. These locations retained importance because they were anchored in collective memory and cultural identity. Their significance persisted even when organized urban life had largely disappeared. In this sense, Britain experienced a strong continuity of place, without maintaining the urban structures that had originally defined those places. Although some large building projects and cultural practices associated with Roman cities continued for a time, Britain no longer possessed cities in the classical sense. The late Roman city became something like a ghostly presence, no longer fully alive yet still shaping political and social life. The apparent disappearance of Roman urbanism might at first suggest a rapid break with the past. But closer examination reveals that the transformation followed patterns familiar from the Roman world itself. Adaptation and reorganization were characteristic responses to crisis within the empire, and similar processes unfolded in Britain. This adaptation laid the foundation for later developments. The eventual reoccupation of former Roman towns was supported by renewed internal trade and the continued use of Roman roads. Some new settlements emerged in connection with religious foundations or economic activity linked to earlier industries. In certain regions, production systems established under Roman rule continued to operate, demonstrating that economic continuity could persist even when urban structures had changed. When former Roman towns were reoccupied on a larger scale, they were transformed rather than restored. New urban layouts often departed from earlier Roman designs, reflecting different social and political priorities. The symbolic value of Roman heritage remained important, but it no longer determined the structure of these communities. The emphasis shifted from preserving the past to reshaping it for new purposes. The process of reoccupation was complex and varied from place to place. Some urban areas were never completely abandoned, but their functions changed repeatedly in response to political, economic, and environmental conditions. In other cases, activity continued in surrounding regions before eventually returning to the urban centre itself. Memory of the past played a crucial role in these developments, guiding decisions about where to settle and how to organise space. Written sources demonstrate that the memory of Roman urbanism remained strong. Early medieval authors compiled lists of cities associated with the Roman past, even when little was known about their contemporary condition. These lists were less concerned with physical reality than with preserving a sense of historical identity. The act of naming these places reaffirmed their importance and reinforced claims to the Roman heritage. For early medieval societies, the continuity of place proved more significant than the continuation of urban life. Maintaining a connection with a location required fewer resources than sustaining a functioning city, yet it still provided powerful symbolic benefits. Even when urban structures had fallen into ruin, the memory attached to a place could support political authority and cultural identity. This attachment to the past shaped decisions about settlement, governance, and social organization. The physical remains of Roman towns also influenced perceptions of authority and power. Their walls, ruins, and monumental structures evoked a sense of permanence and prestige. These features contributed to the reoccupation of certain sites, especially during periods of conflict when defensive advantages became particularly valuable. Yet the new settlements that emerged differed significantly from their Roman predecessors, reflecting changing social and economic conditions. Understanding how early medieval societies perceived Roman urban spaces is essential for explaining their continued importance. Written accounts reveal a complex relationship with the past in which Roman heritage was both remembered and reinterpreted. Certain terms used to describe settlements carried strong associations with Roman authority, even when the places themselves bore little resemblance to classical cities. Language itself became a means of preserving connections with the past. This vocabulary appears in legal documents, religious writings, and historical narratives. References to cities often emphasize their Roman origins, rather than their contemporary reality. Such terminology reinforced claims of legitimacy and authority by linking present institutions with imperial traditions. Even when the physical landscape had changed dramatically, the language used to describe it maintained continuity with earlier forms of power. At the same time, terminology was not always consistent. Some words could refer to settlements of various sizes or functions, reflecting the fluid nature of early medieval communities. The meaning of these terms depended heavily on context, and their usage could shift over time. This flexibility demonstrates that language alone cannot fully explain the transformation of urban space, though it provides valuable insight into contemporary perceptions. Literary works also reveal how Roman urban space was imagined. In poetry and religious texts, cities often symbolized authority, protection, and divine power. They could represent both earthly rule and heavenly order, reflecting a broader cultural association between fortified places and legitimate authority. These symbolic meanings reinforce the connection between urban space and political power, even when actual urban life had declined. Some literary descriptions of ruined Roman cities have been interpreted as evidence that early medieval people viewed them as alien or useless relics. Yet such interpretations overlook the symbolic and allegorical nature of these texts. Rather than documenting physical reality, they often explored themes of time, power, and human mortality. The ruins of Roman cities could serve as reminders of both the greatness of the past and the enduring presence of its legacy. Taken together, these developments demonstrate that Roman urban space remained deeply embedded in the political and cultural life of early medieval Britain. Former cities functioned as sources of legitimacy, reference points for authority, and symbols of continuity with the past. Their influence extended far beyond their physical remains, shaping governance, identity, and cultural expression. The transformation of Roman urbanism in Britain cannot be understood simply as decline or survival. It was a process of reinterpretation in which inherited structures and traditions were reshaped to meet new circumstances. Through adaptation, former Roman spaces continued to exert influence long after their original functions had disappeared. Their legacy endured not in the preservation of urban life, but in the lasting power of memory, symbolism, and institutional tradition. The Church played a central role in this process of transformation. Its relationship with the Roman past can be compared to a building that gradually changes over time. Each generation introduces modifications, adding new features while preserving elements of the original structure. Eventually, the building appears entirely different, yet it remains fundamentally connected to its origins. In a similar way, the Church inherited Roman traditions and adapted them to new circumstances. Through cooperation with political authorities and local communities, it helped reshape Roman institutions while preserving their memory. The Church was not merely a guardian of tradition, but an active force in reorganizing society. It played a crucial role in economic life, political administration, and the preservation of knowledge. Its activities often reinforced regional differences, particularly in frontier areas where local conditions shaped the development of authority. In many regions, religious leaders assumed responsibilities that had once belonged to imperial officials, contributing to the stability of local governance. The Church also preserved the memory of Roman infrastructure through written records, religious narratives, and legal documents. The acquisition of land and the recording of property boundaries ensured that many features of the Roman landscape remained part of collective memory. Through these processes, Roman infrastructure continued to influence political and social organization long after the end of imperial rule. The legal position of the Church further strengthened its role in society. Early law codes granted it significant privileges and protections, reflecting its growing influence within emerging political systems. These laws placed the Church at the center of social hierarchy and recognized its authority alongside that of kings. Such legal recognition enhanced its capacity to shape the use of space, including the reactivation of former Roman sites. The process of acquiring and redistributing land was central to this transformation. Rulers often controlled former Roman spaces and granted them to religious institutions, which then developed them as centers of administration, worship, and economic activity. These transactions reflected both practical needs and symbolic considerations, reinforcing connections with the Roman past while creating new structures of authority. The origins of this royal control over Roman space may lie in earlier military arrangements. During the final phases of Roman rule, soldiers and commanders increasingly gained rights over the land they defended. These arrangements may have allowed later political leaders to claim authority over fortified sites and surrounding territories. Although direct continuity cannot be proven, the transition from imperial administration to local rule appears to have followed legal and institutional frameworks established during the late Roman period. This transformation should not be viewed simply as privatization or decline. Rather, it represents a reorganization of administrative responsibilities in response to changing political conditions. Military leaders assumed greater roles in managing local resources, and their authority gradually evolved into new forms of political power. Through these processes, Roman administrative traditions continued to shape governance, even as the imperial system itself disappeared. After the collapse of Roman authority in the western provinces, some frontier troops, who had once guarded the borders of Gaul, found themselves stranded. Unable to return to Rome and unwilling to submit to new political or religious enemies, they settled permanently in the regions they had long defended. These soldiers allied themselves with local populations, transferred their loyalty along with their military traditions, and passed Roman customs down to their descendants. Over time, their communities preserved elements of Roman identity, maintaining distinctive military symbols, clothing, and practices. Their continued attachment to Roman traditions suggests that the cultural legacy of the empire could survive even in places where imperial power had disappeared. The transformation of authority in the early medieval period also reshaped the composition of elite groups. New ruling classes emerged, replacing older Roman administrative elites. Yet the systems through which wealth and power were organized often retained features inherited from the Roman past. Property structures, legal traditions, and methods of land control continued to operate, even when the people benefiting from them had changed. Such continuity did not require institutional stability in its original form. Instead, older systems could persist because they remained useful, adaptable, and embedded in social practice. Legal traditions in post-Roman Britain reflected this complex inheritance. What later documents reveal is not a clear and unified system of law, but a complicated legal environment shaped by overlapping traditions. Roman legal practices gradually evolved into new forms that differed significantly from their classical origins, yet still retained recognizable elements of earlier principles. Written records from the period suggest that disputes over land and property were resolved through negotiation and precedent, and that legal authority was often constructed through practical solutions rather than fixed rules. Within this changing legal landscape, certain spaces inherited from the Roman period held special status. Fortified enclosures and walled settlements retained authority not only because of their physical presence, but also because of their legal and symbolic importance. These sites represented more than abandoned ruins. They carried with them the prestige and authority of Roman governance. Their continued recognition in written records suggests that they were treated differently from other types of land, reflecting their enduring connection to the imperial past. From the 7th century onward, many of these spaces became the focus of grants to religious institutions. This development followed a pattern seen across much of the former Roman world, where the church gradually became the successor to imperial property. In Britain, this transition occurred somewhat later than on the continent, yet it followed similar principles. Former Roman sites, particularly fortified enclosures, were transferred to ecclesiastical communities, which adapted them for new purposes. Comparable developments took place in continental Europe, where monasteries were frequently founded within Roman settlements, or enclosed spaces with the support of regional rulers. Such foundations served practical needs by providing access to existing structures and materials, but they also carried powerful symbolic meaning. Establishing a religious institution within a Roman site linked new forms of authority to the prestige of the empire and reinforced political legitimacy. A clear example of this process appears in the establishment of a monastery at a former Roman fort on the coast of Kent. The site, once a military installation, was granted by a king for religious use in the late 7th century. The choice of location was not merely practical. By selecting a Roman enclosure, the ruler emphasized his authority and demonstrated a connection to the imperial heritage of the region. The foundation of the monastery therefore functioned both as a religious act and as a statement of political power. Similar patterns can be observed at other locations where former Roman forts or settlements were granted to religious communities. These transfers were rarely accidental. They carried ideological significance and helped shape the political landscape by creating new centres of authority rooted in the Roman past. Through such actions, rulers and religious leaders alike used inherited infrastructure to strengthen their position within emerging systems of power. Evidence from legal documents further supports the idea that former Roman urban spaces often remained under royal control before being granted to the church. Over time, ownership of these areas gradually passed into ecclesiastical hands through a series of land transfers. This process reflects a shifting legal environment in which authority over Roman sites was redistributed according to changing political circumstances. The gradual nature of these transfers illustrates how older structures of power were adapted rather than abruptly replaced. Another revealing example involves a royal estate that later became the site of a monastery. The location preserved traces of earlier traditions, including architectural techniques inspired by Roman construction methods. Such features suggest a conscious effort to evoke the authority of the Roman past. The association of these estates with royal women further highlights the political significance of these sites. Through inheritance or patronage, influential figures use such properties to secure their status and reinforce connections with established traditions. These religious foundations were far from passive institutions. They became important centers of economic activity, governance, and social organization. Monasteries managed agricultural estates, oversaw production, and served as hubs of regional administration. In doing so, they continued functions previously associated with Roman estates and administrative centers. Control over surrounding lands allowed these institutions to influence local economies and maintain stability within their regions. The adaptation of Roman infrastructure also extended beyond physical structures to include systems of land management and economic organization. Control over resources and production networks provided practical benefits for local communities, while reinforcing the authority of those who managed them. The continued use of such systems demonstrates how inherited infrastructure could shape social development long after the political structures that created it had vanished. Although many examples of direct continuity have been lost, surviving evidence suggests that the reuse of Roman resources was widespread in certain regions. In some areas, former urban spaces and fortified enclosures remained part of royal domains before being transferred to religious institutions. The precise legal basis for this control remains unclear, but it may reflect earlier patterns of authority established during the late Roman period. These developments varied significantly from region to region, demonstrating the localized nature of early medieval transformation. The importance of Roman remains extended beyond practical use to include symbolic and ideological functions. Religious and political leaders sought to establish their authority by associating themselves with the legacy of the Roman world. The reuse of Roman structures, the restoration of ancient sites, and the adaptation of earlier traditions all contributed to the creation of a new cultural identity rooted in the imperial past. In Eastern Britain, this process was closely connected with the spread of Christianity. Religious leaders and rulers worked together to establish new forms of authority by linking their actions to Roman precedents. Through carefully constructed narratives, Christian rulers were presented as heirs to a wider tradition that connected them to the history of the Roman Empire. These stories emphasized restoration and renewal, portraying the establishment of Christian institutions as a continuation of earlier imperial achievements. One influential tradition compared royal patrons of Christianity to famous figures from the Roman past who had supported the Church. Such comparisons strengthen the legitimacy of new rulers by placing them within a prestigious historical framework. The restoration of churches and the reuse of Roman sites served as visible evidence of this connection, reinforcing the idea that the new religious order represented a continuation of imperial authority. These narratives also shaped perceptions of religious infrastructure, the restoration of older places of worship, the construction of new churches using Roman materials, and the reorganization of sacred space all contributed to the creation of a symbolic landscape rooted in Roman tradition. Through these actions, religious leaders sought to establish continuity with the past while simultaneously reshaping it to suit new purposes. At times, this process involved redefining existing traditions. Local religious practices or earlier forms of worship were sometimes replaced or reinterpreted to align with the authority of the broader church. Such changes were not necessarily intended to preserve historical continuity, but to maintain the prestige associated with Roman identity. The adoption of new traditions could therefore serve to strengthen connections with the imperial past, even when older practices were abandoned. The adaptation of religious infrastructure also extended to the reuse of pre-Christian sacred sites. Existing places of worship were sometimes transformed into Christian centers through rededication and modification. This approach allowed new institutions to benefit from established locations, while integrating them into a different religious framework. Such practices demonstrate the pragmatic strategies used to establish authority within a changing cultural environment. The spread of Christianity in Britain was closely linked to the reorganization of space. New churches and monasteries were often established at sites connected with Roman infrastructure, creating a network of religious centers that reflected both practical considerations and symbolic goals. The placement of these institutions reinforced connections with the Roman past and helped shape the emerging cultural landscape. The development of this network also reflected broader political ambitions. Religious organization was sometimes modeled on earlier administrative divisions, echoing the structure of Roman governance. Although such plans were rarely realized in practice, they reveal the importance of Roman precedent in shaping early medieval institutions. The attempt to recreate aspects of imperial organization demonstrates the enduring influence of Roman political ideas. The establishment of major religious centers within former Roman settlements further illustrates this connection. Churches built inside Roman city walls or constructed using Roman materials symbolize the continuation of imperial authority in a new form. These foundations were not simply practical developments, but deliberate expressions of ideological continuity. The creation of a symbolic geography linking important religious sites reinforced this sense of continuity. Certain locations were associated with key figures, sacred traditions, and political authority, forming a network of places that reflected both spiritual and temporal power. Movement between these sites created a landscape defined not only by physical distance, but also by shared meaning and historical association. This process contributed to the emergence of a cultural identity rooted in the memory of Rome. The reuse of Roman infrastructure, the adaptation of legal traditions, and the development of new religious institutions all played a role in shaping this identity. Through these transformations, the legacy of the Roman world remained a powerful influence on early medieval society. The relationship between religious and political authority was central to this development. Cooperation between rulers and church leaders allowed both to benefit from the prestige associated with Roman heritage. Control over significant sites, the distribution of land, and the establishment of religious institutions reinforced their shared authority and helped maintain social stability. The symbolic importance of Roman remains extended to the organization of religious life itself. The structure of ecclesiastical authority, the placement of churches, and the use of Roman building techniques all reflected an effort to align new institutions with the traditions of the past. These practices demonstrate how inherited infrastructure could shape not only physical landscapes, but also systems of governance and belief. Even the arrangement of religious institutions within urban space reflected this symbolic program. The establishment of major churches at specific locations within former Roman cities created a deliberate connection between new forms of worship and earlier traditions of authority. The use of Roman materials in construction further emphasized this continuity. The process of adaptation also involved competition between different groups claiming authority over the Roman past. Religious institutions, local rulers, and existing communities all sought to define their relationship with inherited traditions. Control over Roman sites became a means of asserting legitimacy and establishing political dominance. In this context, the transformation of Roman Britain appears not as a simple decline, but as a complex process of reinterpretation. The physical remains of the empire were integrated into new systems of power, while their symbolic significance continued to shape political and cultural life. Through adaptation and reuse, Roman infrastructure became a central resource in the formation of early medieval society. In the landscape of early medieval Britain, certain churches have long been linked to the Roman past, yet the archaeological evidence often tells a more complex story. One example is the Church of St. Pancras in Canterbury, which was once believed to have been a Roman church later restored by Augustine during the Christian mission to Kent. This interpretation was based on the idea that the earliest phase of the building dated back to Roman times. However, later examination of excavation records suggests a different explanation. The structure appears to have been built after the Romano-British period using recycled Roman bricks, rather than being an original Roman church. Only a single coin from the time of Constantine was found near the building, and this alone cannot support the claim of a late Roman origin. Instead of representing a surviving Roman church, the site may have been an important pre-Christian location for Kentish rulers that was later transformed into a Christian place through the dedication to St. Pancras. Rather than preserving a Roman institution, the building formed part of a broader ideological program connected to the Christianization of England. A similar uncertainty surrounds the Church of St. Pancras in London. Earlier traditions described it as Roman in origin, yet archaeological evidence does not confirm this belief. The only supporting claim comes from a 19th century report stating that an altar dated to the year 625 was discovered beneath the church floor during renovations. Such a claim is difficult to verify and raises serious doubts. There is no reliable documentation or material evidence to support the idea of a Roman foundation. The story likely emerged from misunderstanding or later invention. In this case, tradition alone proved insufficient to establish historical truth. Another site that raises questions is the church at Stone by Faversham. The structure itself was rebuilt at a later date, but there are indications that religious activity may have taken place in the area from the early 7th century, possibly outside an earlier Roman building. Excavations have revealed numerous Roman remains nearby and evidence that the area continued to be used between the mid-5th and mid-7th centuries, with only a short interruption in occupation. The discovery of a large amphitheatre and a Romano-British religious sanctuary in the surrounding region suggests that this area held greater importance than previously assumed. However, the dedication of the church to the Virgin Mary appears only in later records, making it difficult to connect the site directly with early Christian activity. The location, therefore, remains uncertain on the symbolic map of conversion, though it clearly demonstrates the practical reuse of Roman materials and spaces. These examples reveal a broader pattern in early medieval England, where religious foundations created a symbolic landscape rooted in Roman memory. Instead of drawing maps with boundaries and images, this landscape was shaped through churches, dedications, and the physical remains of Roman construction. Political realities also influenced these choices. The selection of Canterbury as a centre of power, for example, was likely based more on its regional significance than simply on its identity as a former Roman city. Yet Roman heritage still carried enormous symbolic weight. Urban spaces inherited from Rome could possess an influence extending far beyond their physical limits, shaping political authority and cultural identity. In southeastern England, two different symbolic systems developed that made use of Roman urban heritage. One emerged with Augustine's mission, while another, earlier tradition was connected to Queen Bertha and reflected strong ties with the Merovingian world across the Channel. These two traditions have often been confused, yet they represent different approaches to the Roman past. Augustine's mission tended to establish new foundations in areas associated with Roman history, while Bertha's earlier program made more direct use of existing Roman sites. The network associated with Bertha also reveals a distinctive social dimension. Her family maintained close connections with important religious institutions in Gaul, particularly those dedicated to Saint Martin. Archaeological evidence from sites linked to this tradition shows that some of these locations functioned as burial churches from an early period. The discovery of a richly furnished female grave from the early 7th century in London strengthens the connection between elite women and this religious landscape. The burial followed continental customs and was carefully aligned along an east-west axis, suggesting a connection to Christian practice even if its precise meaning remains uncertain. Churches associated with St. Martin often stood outside city walls, sometimes on earlier Roman burial grounds. In London, the church later known as St. Martin in the Fields appears to have been built on the site of a Roman mausoleum. A similar situation may have existed in Canterbury, where a Roman structure was reused for Christian worship. These sites also show evidence of continued economic activity, including industrial production such as kilns and ovens. This pattern reflects a willingness to reuse Roman sacred buildings directly, transforming them into centres of Christian authority. Some scholars have suggested that one of these churches may have been the earliest Christian centre in London, earlier even than the later cathedral dedicated to St. Paul. The traditional narrative that credited royal patrons with rebuilding churches may have been shaped by later writers who sought to emphasise the role of specific rulers in restoring Christianity. Historical memory was often reshaped to serve political purposes. The meeting point of these two symbolic traditions appears in Canterbury, where Bertha herself was buried in a chapel dedicated to St. Martin. It is striking that none of the churches directly associated with Augustine's mission in the area were rebuilt on Roman structures, even though they were placed near Roman roads, enclosures, and other remnants of the past. This deliberate choice may reflect an ideological strategy. The mission sought to establish a renewed form of Roman Christianity that asserted its authority while distancing itself from earlier local traditions. Two different methods of adapting the Roman past therefore existed side by side. One emphasizing direct reuse of ancient buildings, the other creating new foundations in landscapes shaped by Roman history. This symbolic program was carefully designed for specific audiences. It aimed partly at existing Christian communities in Britain, presenting the new mission as the legitimate heir of Roman Christianity, while separating it from earlier local forms of belief. At the same time, it addressed the political elite of Kent. The ruling class was encouraged to see Roman urban spaces as valuable resources that could strengthen their authority. By associating themselves with the legacy of Rome, rulers could claim a prestigious historical lineage. Later, kings recognized the power of this strategy and used Roman urban spaces to shape the political and religious landscape. Canterbury, for example, experienced a revival as a major centre of authority. New markets and public spaces developed around the cathedral and monastery, demonstrating that symbolic geography could produce real economic and social consequences. The connection to Rome provided not only ideological legitimacy, but also practical advantages in organising urban life. Written narratives from the period reinforce this sense of continuity. Historical accounts emphasise the idea that Christian Britain inherited the legacy of Rome. These stories looked beyond England toward the wider world, linking local developments to broader traditions associated with continental Europe and even the Eastern Mediterranean. The symbolic use of Roman space, therefore, carried meaning that extended far beyond regional boundaries. Control over walled spaces formed a central element of this landscape. These enclosed areas were often granted to monastic communities, both in former Roman forts and within old city walls. Similar practices appeared across England, where early churches were established in Roman enclosures, or within the remains of ancient towns. Even when written records are lacking, archaeological evidence suggests that the pattern was widespread. The placement of religious institutions within Roman spaces was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate attempt to create a new Christian landscape rooted in the authority of the past. Monasteries built within fortified enclosures echoed earlier imperial practices and provided both symbolic prestige and practical security. The influence of earlier administrative policies may also have played a role, encouraging the selection of well-protected locations that required little restoration. The reuse of Roman infrastructure extended beyond individual buildings. Entire systems of governance were shaped by the control of these spaces. Former Roman enclosures became valuable assets in the development of early medieval kingship. By granting such sites to the church, rulers could reinforce alliances with religious authorities, while asserting their role as heirs to Roman power. The spread of ecclesiastical centres across England further illustrates this pattern. Many early bishoprics were established in former Roman cities or in places closely associated with Roman activity. Canterbury, Rochester, London and York all developed as religious centres within the framework of Roman urban geography. Even when new buildings were constructed rather than restored, their placement reflected the continued importance of Roman space. This development did not represent an attempt to recreate the administrative structure of Roman Britain. Knowledge of earlier ecclesiastical organisation was limited, and political conditions had changed significantly. Instead, the choice of locations was guided by symbolic considerations. Roman spaces were valued not because they had once housed bishoprics, but because they embodied the prestige and authority of the Roman world. Historical writers of the period recognized the importance of Roman infrastructure. They described cities, roads, bridges, and fortifications that still remained visible centuries after the end of Roman rule. These structures served as tangible reminders of the past and provided powerful support for claims of continuity. Their physical condition may have varied, but their symbolic value remained intact. In regions such as Western England, the integration of Roman infrastructure into Christian institutions can be traced through legal documents. Royal charters reveal how land associated with Roman sites was granted to monasteries and religious communities. These documents often presented such foundations as part of a broader narrative of conversion, describing the destruction of earlier beliefs and the establishment of Christian authority. The language of these charters shows how the Roman past was used to shape identity. Roman cities were described using terms that emphasized their connection to imperial heritage. The establishment of monasteries within these spaces represented both practical reuse and symbolic transformation. Such actions reinforce the idea that early medieval kingdoms remained part of a recognizable Roman world. Royal involvement in these processes demonstrates the political significance of Roman infrastructure. Grants of land within former Roman cities not only supported religious foundations, but also expressed relationships of power between rulers. Control of these spaces became part of the language of authority, linking political leadership with the prestige of the past. Large-scale building projects further illustrate this strategy. Some churches constructed during this period deliberately reused Roman materials transported over long distances. Their size, design, and construction techniques evoked Roman architecture and proclaimed continuity with imperial traditions. Such buildings served as visible statements of authority and legitimacy. Memory is often treated as if it were a storage box, something that simply holds whatever the past has left behind. But memory is not passive. It can be directed, arranged, and reshaped by people who have reasons to highlight certain things and let others fade. Even in the ancient world, thinkers understood that remembering and searching back through the mind were not the same action. One could hold an image of the past, but one could also actively construct a pathway to reach that image, choosing the order in which ideas appeared and the places where meaning would sit. Later, observers argued that after the Roman world fractured in the West, many formal techniques of trained recall lost their public stage. Insecure roads, unstable politics, and shrinking civic life made the old culture of public speech less central. Learning narrowed into smaller, protected communities, and the grand rhetorical toolkits of earlier centuries mattered less than the daily work of copying, reading, praying, and teaching. Yet the disappearance of one style of trained memory did not mean that early medieval societies became incapable of complex remembrance. The shape simply changed. If people no longer needed to memorize long courtroom speeches, they still needed ways to hold identity together, to explain authority, to justify ownership, and to tell persuasive stories about who belonged where. In that world, memory could be built into landscapes. Stone could do what the orator once did. A road, a wall, a ruined gateway, or a set of reused bricks could carry meaning in a way that needed no lecture. Places could become prompts, and walking through them could become a form of recall. In that sense, the early medieval relationship with Rome was not only historical knowledge. It was a practiced habit of looking at physical remnants and reading them as signals of legitimacy, continuity, and power. Few figures reveal this more clearly than the Northumbrian churchman Wilfrid and the building projects associated with him. The pattern is not limited to his two most celebrated foundations, but extends across a cluster of churches in the region around the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall. Several of these sites stood close to major Roman roads and forts, and they drew heavily on Roman masonry. The geography itself mattered. This border zone was not only littered with Roman material, it was also saturated with the memory of Roman command, movement, and enclosure. It had the feel of a landscape that once organized people through stone and rule. What survived there was not simply rubble. It was a vocabulary. The wider setting helps explain why this area became such a powerful stage for later claims. In parts of the region, forts appear to have remained occupied longer than traditional narratives once assumed, and churches later appeared within or beside those Roman shells. Royal activity also clustered around these places. A Northumbrian palace, remembered by name as being by the wall, shows how rulers attached themselves to the symbolic weight of the frontier. That site was used for high-profile acts that were meant to be seen as decisive, including baptisms of important visiting elites, carried out far from their own home centres. The choice of location was not neutral. It was a way of making power visible by placing it against a backdrop that still carried the aura of Roman authority. Within this environment, Wilfrid's projects look less like convenient reuse and more like deliberate editing of the past. He did not simply take what was available. He selected, arranged, and amplified. His aim was not to preserve local memory as it existed, but to refashion it into a message that supported his position and his ideals. Like earlier missionaries who tried to establish a clear line back to Roman Christianity, he pursued a form of legitimacy that could not easily be challenged. The result was a carefully staged Roman identity, built in the north using northern materials, but designed to feel as if it came from farther away. Wilfrid's public reputation has always been complicated. He is often remembered as intensely Roman in outlook because of his involvement in disputes over correct practice and his repeated journeys to the Mediterranean world. At the same time, his experience was not shaped only by Rome. The Christian world he moved through included strong influences from the Frankish realms and from monastic cultures that were not neatly Roman in a narrow sense. This mixture matters because it shows that his Roman posture was not simply inherited. It was performed. It was assembled from many encounters and then presented as a single, confident identity. The most revealing evidence of that performance is architectural. Contemporary descriptions of one of his great churches emphasize a scale and refinement that were meant to astonish. The building was presented as unmatched in its broad region, full of stonework, columns, and carefully constructed spaces below ground. Later, medieval visitors, familiar with Italy, claim that seeing the place triggered an almost automatic association with the best Roman building they knew. That reaction is important, not because later observers were always accurate, but because it shows what the building was designed to do. It was meant to create recognition. It was meant to produce the sensation of Rome, not simply to function as a church. Ripon, another key foundation tied closely to Wilfrid's life and burial, shows how these choices were embedded within local realities as well. Its location and meaning were shaped by regional politics, older sacred associations, and competing religious traditions. A site that had passed through different identities could become an ideal stage for a new narrative of true Christianity. Beneath the church, the underground spaces made use of stone taken from a nearby Roman town that had once been a central node in the road network. That choice did two things at once. It provided high-quality material, and it quietly transported the authority of a Roman civic centre into a Christian interior. What survives from Wilfrid's era at these sites is limited, but what remains is telling. The underground chambers and passages are elaborate, especially at Hexham, where the plan is larger and more intricate. It includes a main chamber, smaller side spaces, and corridors that twist and turn. This is not the most efficient form for simple storage or burial access. It is a design that produces experience. Its shape invites movement, uncertainty, and attention. It echoes famous subterranean settings associated with the cult of saints in the Roman world, where corridors and chambers guided visitors through relic-rich darkness. Here, however, the effect is created artificially. The passages are built, roofed, and covered. They imitate what might otherwise have been carved from rock. The result is an underground world that feels ancient and inevitable, while actually being carefully manufactured. The material choice reinforces the illusion. Stone was taken from a nearby Roman site, and there are indications that the builders were not merely picking over random rubble, but dismantling standing Roman structures in an organized way. That is a striking point. It suggests planning, authority, and the ability to command labor, transport, and technical knowledge. It also suggests that Roman infrastructure was not just lying around as loose fragments. In some places, it still stood enough to be dismantled like a quarry. The past could be harvested. These underground spaces resist simple classification. They do not neatly match the usual categories of crypts. They resemble certain continental examples in some respects, but they are also distinct, almost experimental. That is part of their significance. They are not copy and paste reproductions. They are interpretations shaped for a particular audience. Their builders assumed that the people who entered them already carried a mental image of what Roman felt like. The spaces worked because the idea of Rome still had value and clarity. A visitor did not need a scholarly explanation to understand what the building was claiming. The building itself did the claiming. The experience would have been even stronger when the spaces were active as sacred environments. Today, the relics are gone, and the sensory world has vanished with them, but the original design likely relied on more than architecture alone. Dim light, incense, chanting, and the presence of revered objects would have turned the passage through the corridors into a staged encounter with holiness. The space would have guided bodies as well as thoughts. In that sense, the crypts functioned like physical memory devices. They used form, material, and movement to call up a shared idea of Rome, linking Christian sanctity to imperial depth. They did not merely recall stories about Rome, they made Rome feel present. This is why it is difficult to explain the Roman masonry at these sites as mere practicality. Practicality mattered, of course. Reused stone was valuable, and transporting it required organization. Building programs had economic and social consequences, pulling labor and resources into new patterns. But the choices at Hexham and Ripon go beyond convenience. The Roman stone is not hidden as an internal core. It becomes part of the message. The underground plan is not just functional, it is theatrical. The entire arrangement is a form of citation, like quoting a well-known line in a new speech, expecting the listener to recognize it immediately. Some have argued that these churches and crypts were unusual, even puzzling, perhaps too consciously archaic to reflect a normal style of the period. It is true that nothing quite like them appears on the same scale elsewhere. Yet the broader impulse to imitate Roman forms and methods was not isolated. Other major religious centres in England also adopted a Roman manner in building and decoration, and some of the finest continental craftsmanship of the age can be found in English contexts. That point should not be missed. Early medieval Britain was not sealed off from wider trends. It could participate in them, sometimes more visibly than regions that are assumed to be the cultural core. This participation depended on another kind of infrastructure that does not survive as ruins: social networks. Craftsmen, glassmakers, masons, and clerics moved along routes of patronage and connection. Relationships with communities across the Channel and contacts reaching into Italy created channels through which techniques and styles could travel. Even formal documents through witness lists and institutional ties pulled people into shared projects of stone and status. None of the grand claims made by architecture would have mattered if the surrounding society could not read them. The message required receivers. The memory required an audience. This idea appears again in a later setting where memory is imported, not through stone corridors, but through words. An influential scholar connected with York crafted a highly polished praise of his city using classical literary patterns that had once served the celebration of ancient urban greatness. The move was bold because it did not depend on precise knowledge of the Roman city's factual past. It depended on atmosphere and inheritance. York still carried built traces that were hard to ignore. More importantly, it had become a community capable of seeing itself as an urban unity, a patria with a shared identity. In that context, using an old Roman form to praise a Christian city was another way to move Rome into the present. The method echoes Wilfrid's strategy. Choose a powerful medium, use recognizable building blocks, and apply them to a local landscape in a way that feels inevitable. Seen together, these examples suggest a larger pattern across the first generations involved in reshaping Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. There was a sense of urgency to reconnect Britain with wider ecclesiastical structures that drew authority from Rome as both past and living reference point. To achieve that, church leaders and their allies used the remains of Roman infrastructure, sometimes reworking what existed, sometimes creating new Roman experiences where local Roman traces were scarce. This was not only reuse, it was takeover. It was the act of claiming the past as property, then managing it, narrating it, and redirecting it. One striking feature of this process is how often influential women appear at the center of foundations and policies that activated Roman heritage. Queens and abbesses could shape religious geography through their patronage, their personal networks, and their authority over land and communities. They received direct attention from church leaders at the highest level. They founded houses that became anchors of Christian identity. And in some cases, they pursued programs that did not simply follow male-dominated political priorities. Their actions could carry strong continental connections and could reflect distinctive agendas about which parts of the inherited world should be reused and how. In several regions, female leadership is not a marginal detail, but a recurring force in the creation of early Christian landscapes and their imperial undertones. At the same time, this was not a story of the church acting alone. Lay elites were essential partners. Kings and nobles benefited from the symbolic capital that Roman spaces could still generate, but their ability to activate those resources on their own was often limited. The church provided a mechanism. It could translate ruins into authority, roads into legitimacy, walls into governance. In return, rulers gained a kind of successor status, the impression that they were not merely powerful in the present, but anchored in a deeper tradition. The imperial tone of this partnership should not be softened. Roman memory was not only spiritual decoration, it was political language. The deliberate importing of memory, which can look like manipulation from a modern angle, does not appear to have been an accidental byproduct. In several major cases, it was a conscious strategy. Building in a Roman manner, placing foundations in Roman spaces, transporting Roman material, and crafting literary forms that evoked ancient prestige were ways of tightening control over meaning. The past could be turned into a resource, then fenced, granted, managed, and performed. The church's success here was not only religious, it was infrastructural. It mastered the art of making old stones speak a new message, and it did so in partnership with those who wanted power to feel ancient as well as strong.